Well, here we are, last day, last topic. We're going to be talking today about international economics. International economics includes this just enormously expanding relationship between the United States and other countries and each other. And it includes discussion on trade and exchange rates. So there's lots of material here. We're just going to hit on the main points of these really important topics. But the thing I really want to focus on more so than anything else is how international exchange rates affect the balance of trade. So let's start off with that topic. The balance of trade before coronavirus is one of the things that was in the news a lot, a discussion of why the United States' balance of trade was so persistently negative over the last 40 years. And part of the reason for that are exchange rates, which we'll get into. But when we talk about the balance of trade, or when the balance of trade is reported, really what is being discussed are net exports. Remember, we have all those components of aggregate demand. We have consumption, we have investment, we have government spending, and we've covered all of those pretty thoroughly. Now we're talking about net exports. A country's total exports minus their imports. We call that net exports, but you could also call it the trade balance. If exports are greater than imports, you have a positive trade balance. And if imports are greater than exports, you have a negative trade balance. Now, whether or not that's a good thing is really almost inconsequential. It's just a number. It's just a mathematical relationship. And so people kind of get tied up in the idea of positive and negative, thinking negative is bad and positive is a good thing. But I think as we're going to see here, there are multiple ways to look at this, or multiple sides of a coin. In fact, that's one of the things that I really want to focus on as we start off here. And that is that whenever we look at trade balances, whenever we look at exchange rates, whenever we look at anything really in international economics, there are always two perspectives to take into consideration. And those perspectives change. So we're going to get into what that means here as well. But before we launch into the slides, I want to make just one other note, because as our economic conditions change at the macro level, we should see some changes in international economic relationships. In fact, we already are seeing these things. Whenever a country goes into a recession, it tends to be that they spend less on everything, including goods made in other countries, which would be imports. So whenever we go into a recession, we tend to import a lot less. If the recession is widespread enough, if it is affecting other parts of the world, that means we also will export less, because the goods we export are other countries' imports. So if they're importing less, it means necessarily we have to be exporting less. So in bad economic times, we can kind of be misled to thinking that things are improving on the trade balance front, because we export less and we're going to import less, and usually the trade balance becomes less negative. Now, on the other side, when the economy is good, we tend to import more. We're buying more things from all different parts of the world. We also tend to export more, but usually what happens is the trade balance becomes more negative, which isn't a bad thing. And so what I want you to take away from this very sort of initial portion of our discussion here is that trade balances being positive or negative aren't really a good measure of economic well-being, because if you have a negative trade balance, it can mean that your economy is just doing really, really well. Okay, if you're not confused yet, that's good. If you're starting to get confused, don't worry about it. International economics really, if you understand one thing about international economics, it's going to help you understand all of it. And that is that when we look at international economics, it's almost like looking in a mirror. And when you look in that mirror, you see a reflection of what you're doing. And usually that reflection is doing the opposite. If you think about international economics as being one country acting and the reaction being the reflection in the mirror, then I think you're going to start to get at least a fundamental handle on what's going on in international economics. So let's start with that. Let's take a look at that mirror and see what that means as we study this last topic of ours. So here's that mirror I was talking about. You look in a mirror and you see the reflection. Whenever we deal with international economics, there's always two countries involved, two countries that we need to pay attention to. And whatever the one country is doing on this side of the mirror, the other country on the other side of the mirror, the reflection, is doing the opposite. So we mentioned the idea of net exports just a couple of minutes ago. And again, that's the trade balance. Net exports are the total exports of a country, what they make and sell overseas to other countries, minus what they buy from other countries. And again, if exports are greater than imports, you have a trade surplus. And if exports are less than imports, you have a trade deficit. We could think of this as being the trade surplus as being a positive trade balance, and the trade deficit is having a negative trade balance. Now, the United States has had this negative trade balance since at least the early 80s. But there is a little bit of a misperception here, because not everything the United States sells overseas results in this negative trade balance. We actually have a trade surplus in services. So there are different things that we export to other parts of the world. We export goods, we export cars and computers and pharmaceuticals and agricultural products. But we also export services, medical services, educational, financial services, entertainment services, and we're really, really good at that. We export those things, and we actually have a trade surplus in services, but a trade deficit in goods. Now, let's get to some of the parts of this international economic infrastructure. The first thing I want to talk about here are exchange rates. And you all have been paying attention, I hope, to the exchange rates for the currencies that you hold. So whether it's the pound or Bitcoin or the Argentinian peso or the Turkish lira or whatever currency you have, you've been paying attention to this because the value of those currencies have changed over the course of our semester. An exchange rate is just the price that you pay for a foreign currency. So whenever we're talking about the price of, say, the Mexican peso, we can talk about it in how many dollars you have to give up to get that peso. So the price of the peso in terms of dollars, that's the exchange rate. Now similarly, if you live in Mexico and you have pesos, you're interested in the price of dollars in terms of pesos. So there are two exchange rates for the two countries that we're examining. One would be the dollar price of pesos, and the other would be the peso price of dollars. Currencies are looked at relative to each other. They're looked at the relative strength against the other country's currency. So here's a picture of the buff George Washington. He's been in the gym, he's been lifting weights, he's been watching what he eats, he's been just really working out. And this cover of The Economist from a few years ago depicts this as the mighty dollar. We would call this the strong dollar. The strong dollar the strong any kind of currency is a currency that can buy a lot of another country's currency. Now, if you have something that's strong, you necessarily have to have something that's weak. So if the dollar is strong, and we're looking at the comparison between dollars and pesos, if the dollar is strong, then the peso would be weak. So the strong dollar can buy lots of pesos, but the peso, being weak, cannot buy very many dollars. That's what we mean by strong and weak. So let's take a look at the exchange rate between the dollar and the peso to see what this, what we mean here. And then we're going to now then take that information and translate it over to see how that's going to affect trade. Currently, $1 can buy approximately 25 pesos. So if you're going to Mexico, you take your dollar, you convert it into pesos. As we'll talk about here in a minute, people in Mexico, in a lot of parts of Mexico, don't want dollars. They can't go to the store and buy things in dollars. They need pesos to buy the stuff that they need. But if you're in Mexico, this is not the way you are looking at the equation. What you're looking at, if you're from Mexico, is how many dollars can 1 peso buy me? So to figure out the Mexican perspective, so over here we have basically the exchange rate of pesos per dollar. But if you're from Mexico, you want to know the exchange rates of dollars per peso. So to figure that out, you need this part right here to equal 1. How many dollars does 1 peso buy? So really what you're going to do is you're just going to take this equation and divide each side of it by 25. So $1 equals 25 pesos. If we divide each side through by 25, then that gives us, on the right-hand side, 1 peso, and that's equivalent to about $0.04 or 4 cents. So the exchange rate of dollars per peso is 4 cents for 1 peso. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that's sort of our starting point. $1 for 25 pesos or 4 cents for 1 peso. Things don't stay the same very often, and you've seen this as well throughout the semester. You've seen the value of your currency change. So let's take a look at how that happens and what that means in terms of just the whole trading process. So here we start again with $1 equals 25 pesos. And if the dollar appreciates, we say it's getting stronger. So if the value of the dollar goes up relative to pesos, it means that the dollar can buy more pesos. So let's say that the exchange rate for the dollar appreciates, so that instead of being able to buy 25 pesos, now you can buy 25.5 pesos for every dollar. You can buy a little bit more than you could the day before. On the other hand, maybe the value of the dollar goes down. Maybe instead of being able to buy more pesos than it could the day before, maybe the dollar depreciates or gets weaker. If that's the case, then the dollar can buy fewer pesos. So maybe instead of being able to buy 25 today, it can buy 24.5. It's not a huge change, but it's a significant change. It's getting weaker. And that's going to have an impact on trade. But that's just the US side. Remember, there's always 2 sides to the trade coin, and there's 2 sides to the foreign exchange coin as well. So if we have the dollar getting stronger against the peso, that necessarily means that the peso is getting weaker. So if the dollar can buy more pesos, that means the peso getting weaker can buy fewer dollars. So again, we're going to start off with $1 equals 25 pesos, and 1 peso equals $0.04. Now, if the dollar appreciates, if it gets stronger, it can buy more pesos, 25.5. If we make that side of the this equation, if we take the 25.5 pesos and make that 1, that means we're going to divide each side of our equation by 25.5. That would make the peso side 1, and it will tell us how many dollars the peso can buy. If the peso is getting weaker because the dollar's getting stronger, then we should be able to buy fewer dollars with our peso. And indeed, that's what happens. We have a weaker peso. The peso can now only buy $0.039. It's not a lot less, but it's less than it was the day before. As the dollar gets stronger, the peso necessarily gets weaker. That's the mirror. That's what's going on. That's the two sides of the coin. We have one side getting stronger, one side getting weaker. And if the dollar were to get weaker, then the peso would get stronger. So let's just take a breath for a second. So far, we've seen that there's this relationship between currencies, that there's this basically mirror reflection of currencies, so that currencies change. As one currency changes value, it impacts the other country's currencies as they're trading with each other. In fact, this happens with any two countries' currencies. So if you look at the dollar versus the peso, the dollar might be getting stronger and the peso getting weaker. But if you were to compare the dollar against, say, the yen, the Japanese currency, maybe in that case, the dollar is getting weaker against the yen and the yen's getting stronger. So whether a country's currency gets strong or weak depends only upon its relationship to another country's currency, one country at a time. Now, we could say that the dollar is getting stronger against most other currencies, but there might be one or two that it's getting weaker against. All of this exchange rate, all of these transactions in the foreign exchange market, which is where the currencies are getting traded, all of that is just a one-to-one country trade-off. It's all dictated by demand and supply. But in order to understand why anyone would want any other country's currency, we have to understand something more fundamental about trade. So let's take a look at that fundamental part of trade and then see how these exchange rate machinations affect trade as a whole. Okay, so as far as trade is concerned, there's actually two different kinds of trades that take place at the international level. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, workers in Mexico don't want to be paid in dollars. They want to be paid in pesos, because pesos are how you pay the rent, they're how you pay for food at the grocery store, they're how you pay for clothes for your kids. You need pesos in Mexico. So at some point in time, when there is a trade taking place between two different countries, there first of all has to be a trade of currency. So if you go to Walmart and you buy something made in Mexico, or you buy something made in China, or you buy something made in Japan or in Germany, at some point in time, it may not be you doing it. In fact, it probably isn't you doing it. But at some point in time, there's got to be a trade of currencies. Of course, if there's a trade of currencies, whether one currency is stronger or weaker is going to be really important. We're getting to that point. But before we get to that point, we also have to understand that people don't want to go through the hassle of trading currencies. That's a pain in the neck. You don't really want a currency unless it's just for a souvenir. I've been to many countries around the world, and I've got different currencies from these different parts of the world, and it's nice to have them, but I can't go out and spend them anywhere. I just kind of have them in a jar somewhere saying, hey, look at this. The reason people want currencies of other countries, for the most part, is because there is a derived demand for that currency because of what the currency can buy for you. We talked about derived demand earlier in the semester when it came to why a company would want to hire you. We said there's a derived demand. Companies demand labor because consumers demand what the company is producing. We can take that idea of derived demand and drop it onto our foreign exchange discussion here. There's a derived demand for Mexican pesos because there's a demand for the things that Mexico produces. So, in this case, people have a demand for cars. Those cars come from Mexico. So at some point, to get the car from Mexico to the United States, we need to buy Mexican pesos to pay for the car. That's what we mean by derived demand. There's a trade of currency, and then there's a trade of goods and services. So now, we can see what happens when the value of currency changes and what the impact on trade will be. Think about it this way. If anything gets more expensive, as we've learned in this class, and your income stays the same, if something gets more expensive, you buy less of it. So if cars get more expensive, people on the whole buy fewer cars. But the same logic applies to foreign currency. So if a country's currency gets stronger, it means somebody else in another country can buy less of it. And if you can buy less of the country's currency, it means you can buy fewer of that country's goods. So in terms of exports, if the dollar gets stronger, it means that you can buy fewer dollars if you live in Mexico. And if you can buy fewer dollars, it means you buy fewer goods from the United States. So for the United States, exports are going to go down. There are fewer of them being sold because people can't afford them, because people can't afford the currency. Basically, your currency is more expensive and so are your goods. In terms of imports, however, the dollar is stronger, which means it can buy more Mexican pesos, which means you can buy more Mexican goods. That means you're going to import more from Mexico. So your currency is strong and you can now buy more goods from other parts of the world. So in terms of the trade balance, if exports go up and if exports go down and imports go up, then your trade balance is going to fall. You import more, you export less, and that makes the trade balance more negative with a strong dollar, which seems counterintuitive. Strong dollar should be good, but strong dollar has a negative impact on the trade balance. Now, from the Mexican perspective, everything is the reflection of what we just saw in the United States. Everything is upside down. As far as exports are concerned, there are going to be more exports. The United States can buy more pesos, so it can buy more Mexican goods. Your currency is less expensive, and so are the things that you sell. In terms of imports, well, the dollar's more expensive, which makes U.S. goods more expensive, so we're not going to buy as many of them. Your currency is less valuable, so you buy fewer foreign goods. So what's that going to do to the trade balance? Well, if you export more and import less, the trade balance is going to rise. It's just a mathematical calculation. If the positive number in the calculation gets bigger, that's the exports, and the negative number in the calculation gets smaller, that's your imports, then the total number is going to get bigger. So weak currency means a more positive trade balance, and a strong currency means a more negative trade balance. Well, this world is nuts. So what happened to your currency values? You've been following a particular currency this entire semester. What's going on here? Well, in some cases, in particular in the case of the Saudi Riyal, you notice that it didn't really change all that much. And that is because of something we call an exchange rate regime. An exchange rate regime refers to how the value of your currency is determined. And one of the exchange rate regimes that exists is something we call a floating or a flexible exchange rate regime. This is the way most modern large economies work, where the market determines the value of your currency, where there is a change in demand or supply, and that impacts the value of your currency. Let's take a look at how that plays out by using the tool we always use when we talk about markets, and that's demand and supply. So, we'll start off with our basic setup, but now we have to put specific values on our axes. In the case of dollars, so let's just look at the dollar side of things. The quantity on our quantity axis will be the quantity of dollars in the marketplace. The price is the price of those dollars, which is the exchange rate. But specifically, we want to look at how many pesos it takes to buy a dollar. So what we're doing here is we are looking at the Mexican side of the story. This is the Mexican side because we're looking to buy dollars. If you live in the United States, you're not looking to buy dollars. And you're looking to pay a price of pesos in terms of dollars. So, here's the demand. And here's the supply. Now, the supply is just a straight line because the supply is fixed due to the fact that the amount of currency is controlled by the government. So the amount of currency is not affected here by anything that happens in the market. It happens outside the market. So here is our exchange rate. How many pesos per dollar? Well, as we saw earlier, it's 25 pesos per dollar. That's how many pesos you would have to buy a dollar. Now, what shifts the curves? Well, primarily what shifts the curves are changes in the demand for the goods or services that people are wanting to buy. So, shifting demand means that there's a change in demand for goods or services made in America. Since we're comparing pesos to dollars. So if the price of pesos per dollar goes up, that means there's an increase in demand for the things that are made in America. So here we have the increase in the price of pesos. It's almost always an issue of demand when we're talking about floating exchange rates. What's going on lately, however, is a little different than this. There is still a change in demand for things from America, but primarily the thing that's changing is that people have a greater demand for U.S. financial assets. Because the world is such an uncertain place, people want to buy more financial assets in which they can be confident. Government bonds, stock in U.S. companies, bonds of U.S. companies. They want to buy U.S. financial assets. If you want to buy those, you need more dollars. So we see the demand shifting and the price of the dollar going up. And so what we see here is this is the dollar getting stronger. You need more pesos to buy a dollar. The dollar's getting more expensive, and that's the stronger dollar. Now, on the other side of this is what's going on from the U.S. side. So here's the U.S. perspective. Here we're looking at the quantity of pesos, and the dollar that you have to pay per peso. Here's the supply. Here's the demand. Well, in the US, we see the demand for pesos, or the demand for Mexican-made products, going down. And the result is that the dollar price per peso is going down. This is the weaker peso. So it's just the flip side of the story. As one country's currency appreciates, the other country's currency depreciates. And that's the way it works for most of the world. And so we see these wild swings in the values of currencies. Maybe not wild on a normal basis, but we see these changes in values of currency, of the South Korean won, of the Chinese yuan, of all of those currencies that you had. Most of them work on this floating or flexible exchange rate system, except for one. And that was the Saudi rial. The rial is different than these other currencies that you've owned. The Saudi rial is on a different kind of exchange rate regime. The rial is based on what we call a pegged or a fixed system. A pegged or a fixed system is one in which a government decides we're going to try to keep our currency at a constant exchange rate. And we'll manipulate that exchange rate through changing the supply of our currency. For a long time, China has been accused of doing this. You maybe remember President Trump saying that China is a currency manipulator. Well, they're not the only ones. Saudi Arabia does this as well. And that's why the value of the Saudi rial hasn't changed very much at all over the course of the semester, because the Saudi government is trying to keep that exchange rate fixed or pegged so that there's a constant value to that currency. Now, the Chinese government was accused of doing this to keep the value of the Chinese yuan low, because a weaker currency, as we've seen, affects trade balances. The Saudi government does this primarily to try to maintain the price of oil, to try to maintain a certain level of oil, because their economy is so heavily dependent upon that oil. But anyway, these ideas of exchange rate regimes and the impact that they have on traders, things for us to be aware of. We would get much more into this in a money and banking, or more specifically in an international economics course. But this isn't an international economics course, so let's kind of back off the exchange rate talk here for a little bit and move on to the other area of international economics, which is trade. Just the idea of trade between countries is really a vital aspect of modern economies. We've talked about trade and talked about how we decide who we trade with, in part based on the idea of comparative advantage. We figure out who has the comparative advantage in trade, and we say, you all produce that, and then we'll produce what we have a comparative advantage in, and then we exchange those things. So the United States has comparative advantages in technology and agriculture, and we trade those things to countries that have comparative advantages in manufacturing. Of course, we don't trade goods for goods, we trade goods for money, and that affects the trade balance. So let's take a look just a little bit at trade, and primarily what I want to focus on is not why we trade. I think hopefully by this point in the semester you understand why we trade. We trade to get things that other people produce more efficiently than we do, because we can get it more cheaply. What I want to do is focus on why we want to get in the way of trade at all. This is one of the hallmarks of the Trump presidency prior to the coronavirus, was this trade war that had started with the Chinese economy. So let's take a look at sort of the impact of trade wars and talk a little bit about why people might engage in them. First of all, let's talk about who we trade with. The United States trades with lots of different countries. There's a few countries on on the do not trade with list. Venezuela, North Korea are a couple that come to mind. But we want to trade with people who have comparative advantages. And so we make special arrangements with these countries. Probably the most important trade relationship we have in the United States is with the countries who are close to us, with Mexico and with Canada. We are involved in what's called the USMCA, or it used to be called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's now the USMCA, which is the US-Mexican-Canadian Agreement. And what this does is this allows us to trade with these countries very cheaply. Basically, except for some exceptions, we trade with very few tariffs or very few barriers between our countries. So goods can move easily from one country to the other. And it reduces the cost of buying goods made in other countries, which is really great for consumers. The United States is also in a trade agreement called CAFTA. CAFTA is the Central American Free Trade Agreement. So we trade with countries in Central America. And there are some countries that are not on the list, but the members of this particular trade organization are trading with each other and keeping trade barriers low as well. Then there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was supposed to be a trade agreement between countries on the Pacific Rim, the rim of the Pacific Ocean, except for China. When Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were running against each other, they both basically said, no way, we're not doing this. So we don't do the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is probably not a great idea. It would certainly reduce costs for things that we buy from those countries. Other parts of the world obviously engage in trade agreements as well. There's probably the biggest one, the most important, at least in terms of the countries that we would regularly engage in, is the Eurozone. The Eurozone, if you're part of the European Union, you have all of these great trade agreements that allow you to move goods from one country to the other. And this was one of the huge sticking points, and still is one of the huge sticking points, of Britain leaving the European Union. They want to be part of the free trade zone, but if they're not part of if they're not a member of any of the other components of the European Union, then why should they get this great economic benefit? So that's something that's going to be hashed out eventually. If we ever get back to normal, people will say, hey, remember Brexit? We still got to work that one out. So trading with other countries, trading with other parts of the world is monumentally beneficial. There is usually some pain in terms of reorganizing your economy if there are jobs that basically are outsourced to other countries. People may have to find a new job, and that certainly, I don't want to understate how painful that can be at the micro level. At the macro level, though, more trade is good. This is one of the things that almost all economists agree on. The more we trade, the better off we are. But there are lots of attempts to put barriers in place of, or in front of, trade, and to limit the amount of trade that we engage in. So let's take a look now, as we're kind of rapidly getting to the end of the material. Let's take a look at the impact of trade barriers on free trade and why someone would advocate for those trade barriers. The trade barrier that's gotten the most play in the news lately are tariffs. For a while, it was like the only word coming out of the president's mouth was tariff. We're going to put a tariff here. We're going to put a tariff there. We're going to put tariffs everywhere. And it is an instrument that the government has to try to deal with issues of trade, but it's a pretty blunt instrument. There are other trade barriers that you can adopt. There are quotas, which is an even more blunt and in some cases an illegal tool in terms of blocking trade. A quota is simply a numerical limit. It would say you cannot sell more than this number of, say, cars in the United States. And once you hit that limit, you're done. A tariff is a tax on trade. And as we've seen in here, taxes change how much economic activity goes on. It reduces the amount of trade. So whenever there is a tariff put in place, it means that somebody's going to have to pay more And so if prices are going up, there's going to be less of that activity. And this is absolutely clearly bad for the macro economy. There's no doubt about it. I'm going to show you the trade model here in just a moment, and I hope you will see that this is unambiguously bad for the macro economy. But people advocate for tariffs because it can be good for the micro economy. It can be good for specific businesses. It can be good for specific industries. But at the whole, or in the main, it is bad for the macro economy. Okay, so why is it bad? So let's look at our last demand and supply model of the semester. Here we're going to look at the market for cars. This would work for any market where we're trading with another country. But we'll just use cars. It's a pretty simple one. Here we'll have quantity on the quantity axis. We'll have price of cars on the price axis. And we're going to have demand and supply. So we'll start off with, here's our supply curve, and here is our demand curve. Just like any market where the two lines cross, we have equilibrium. And here's where things start to get a little bit different. The first thing I want to note is that this supply comes from domestic producers. So these are companies who are producing cars within, let's just say this is the United States. So this is the car market in the US. So we have domestic producers of cars. And so where the two lines are crossing, we have the domestic price. I'm just going to call this PDOM for domestic. And we have the domestic quantity at that price. Let's put a little X there, because it's always going to be the domestic quantity. So this quantity is the quantity for the US. Okay. Now, let's say that there is an increase in the number of sellers of cars in this market because there are more foreign producers sending cars to the United States. So we have our domestic producers, we have Ford and General Motors, and then we have other countries who produce cars like Hyundai and Toyota and BMW. And these companies in other countries start sending their cars to the United States. How's that going to change the market? Let's think about it for a second. If we have more sellers in the market, that's going to shift the supply curve to the right. So this new supply curve, we're going to call the supply curve with free trade. This is the US manufacturers plus foreign manufacturers. So we have a whole bunch of new sellers in the market. Because of that change in supply, we're going to see that the price of cars goes down. So we'll call this the free trade price. And for consumers, this is great. We see that in the market, the number of cars goes up. So we'll call this the quantity with free trade. And consumers are happy. And if you remember, when we look at markets, one of the things we look at as part of the market is the change in the surpluses that exist. So we have consumer surplus and producer surplus. To start off, our consumer surplus is this area here. The area above the price and below the demand curve. So this is the consumer surplus before trade. There's producer surplus as well. That's this area here. So this is our producer surplus before trade. But once trade starts, once trade is allowed, things change here. The consumer surplus is still the area above the price and below the demand curve, which means now the consumer takes this amount away from the producer and it captures this amount here. So this amount in this kind of yellow color is surplus that didn't exist when it was just the domestic market. But now with more trade, there's more surplus. The producers, however, are kind of left with this. The producers are left with just this amount here. So they had a lot more. Now they have less. But if you look at this from the macro perspective, this is why we say at the macro level, trade is always good. I'm going to put some numbers in here. We'll say this is area 1, area 2, area 3, and area 4. Before trade, the total surplus was area 1 plus 2 plus 3. And then after trade, the total surplus is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus that yellow area 4. This is why economists look at trade and say, this is good. We want this. There's more benefit to the overall economy. But if you're a producer of cars, you're looking at this and saying, whoa, this isn't so hot. We have less than we did before. Not only do we have less producer surplus, but we are selling fewer cars. The domestic production has gone down from when there was no trade at all. These producers are looking at this and saying, this stinks. The gap between what the domestic producers produce and the amount that's being purchased in the economy has to come from somewhere else. It's not domestic. That gap is filled by imports. So foreign companies are producing cars, selling them in the United States, which causes the price to go down for consumers, which causes the U.S. macroeconomy to have more surplus, more value created. So at the macro level, this is good. But at the micro level, those producers are not happy. And they have a significant interest in making sure that this situation does not continue. So they might seek trade protection. They might seek a tariff against foreign cars. And if they're successful in getting a tariff put in place, let's see what happens. Once again, here's quantity, here's price. Here's the domestic supply. Here's the demand. And we had introduced this free trade supply. Okay, so here we are. Here's the price before free trade. Here's the price after free trade. And here is the producer surplus as a result of free trade. All right. The producers want more surplus. They want to sell more cars. Here again is the quantity for domestic producers. And here is the quantity with free trade. So, in order to block the number of foreign-made cars in the United States, what can be put in place here is either a quota, which simply says you cannot sell more, or we could put a tariff in place. A tariff is like a tax. And remember, a tax, if it's placed upon the seller, causes the supply curve to shift to the left. So here is our last supply curve. We're going to call this the supply with the tariff. It causes the free trade supply curve to shift to the left, which gives us a new equilibrium point. So we'll call this the quantity with the tariff. And here is the price with the tariff. And so that changes this situation tremendously. At that tariff price, domestic producers are able to be a little bit more competitive. So here is the quantity domestic with the tariff. So the gap between what's being bought and sold is not as large as it was before. In other words, the number of imports has changed. So in blue here, you see how many cars we used to import, and in purple there, you see how many cars we're importing as a result of the tariff. There are fewer cars. You also see the number of cars produced by the domestic producer increasing. So this is good for the domestic producer. This is good for the micro level producer because they also recapture some of their surplus. So this area here, which had been consumer surplus, is now transferred back to the producer. It's not as good as it was before there was any trade at all, but it's better. Now, what about the consumer side? Well, the consumer still has the area above the price and below the demand curve, but it's gotten a little bit smaller. Remember, they used to have this area, they used to have that area in yellow, which was all of this, which included all of this. This area in yellow, and this stuff up here too, was the new surplus. They keep some of that new surplus, but they lose the area that's here, just the area in yellow. Now, some of that isn't that big of a concern at the macro level. Some of this area is going to go to the government. The government's going to collect some taxes here. The rate of the tax, which is the size of the tariff, times the number of imports becomes government revenue. So this box, that's just transferring it to some other part of the economy. At the macro level, it's not that big a deal. For the consumer, it is kind of a big deal. They're paying more. But what really worries economists is what happens to these two triangles right here. That triangle and that triangle. These two areas represent surplus that's not transferred to anybody. And if you remember our discussion about taxes, whenever a tax is put in place, it causes a loss of surplus. And these two black triangle areas, these are our old deadweight losses. Value that was there before the tax was put in place, and now it's not there anymore. So the overall economy is harmed by the tariff. The consumer surplus goes down. So with the tariff, consumer surplus falls. Producer surplus goes up, and government revenue goes up, but those two things don't increase enough to offset the loss of consumer surplus because there is a deadweight loss. And that deadweight loss causes there to be less total surplus than if we were to just let the free trade take place on its own. So that brings us to our last question here. If tariffs specifically, and trade barriers more generally, create deadweight loss and reduce total value to the economy, why are they used at all? Who is advocating for a smaller economy? Well, you'd be surprised. There are actually a lot of people who are advocating for a smaller economy for a number of different reasons. So let's take a look at a few of these. One of the most common arguments in favor of trade barriers is national security. Typically, this refers to just the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and those kinds of things. And the idea that if we were to ever go to war with a country, we want to be able to have the ability to produce the things that we need to produce to fight the war within our borders. We don't want to have to rely upon other countries for steel or ammunition or communications equipment because we might be at war with them, or it might be that our enemies can cut the supply lines very easily. So typically when we talk about trade barriers, the idea of national security comes up. Interestingly, one of the things that has come out of this coronavirus talk is whether or not we need things like this to be considered parts of national security. This is one of those N95 ventilator masks that people can't find anywhere. And what is being talked about in terms of our reliance upon other countries is that we shouldn't rely upon them for things that we need to do to fight pandemics. So whether it's one of these kind of masks or ventilators or any of the medical equipment that people so desperately need, people who are in favor of national security defenses for in terms of trade protection, in terms of trade barriers, are saying maybe these are some of the things we should have on the list that aren't there currently. Another argument is something that's referred to as infant industry protection. This is something that seems a little bit older in terms of protection. This is an argument that Adam Smith made at times and that Alexander Hamilton made at times. And the idea is that if you have a young industry that you want to start up in your country, it's almost impossible for those young upstart industries to compete with established manufacturers. So whether it is in terms of textiles, which is what Adam Smith talked about, or shipbuilding, which is what one of the things that Alexander Hamilton talked about, the idea was we want to protect these infant industries and allow them time to grow so that they can catch up and be competitive with established industries. We want to be able to do this on our own. We don't want to necessarily rely upon other countries and other parts of the world. The problem with the infant industry argument is that at some point the infants have to grow up. And if you continue to protect these industries and claim that they need this infant industry protection, then those countries never grow up, or those companies never grow up. They never sort of wean themselves from that protection, and so you're always dealing with these trade barriers. It's kind of like the idea of, at some point, you got to leave your parents' house. They can't just continue to allow you to live there. This is one of the things that I am looking forward to as a parent, is telling my kids, it's been great having you here, but get out. It's time for you to go make your fortune or seek your fortune and make your own way in the world. You're not children anymore. You've grown up. And unless a country says to their infant industries, you've grown up, then there's a tendency for this barrier to be put in place for a lot longer than it should be. Another argument is in favor of barriers to trade is a retaliation for dumping. So this is an argument that was been made against Japan and China very recently, and some other Southeast Asian countries where we accuse them of dumping their products into our country, which basically means you're selling incredible volumes in our country for below cost. And so you're necessarily driving our businesses, our domestic businesses, out of business because you're selling it things to us so cheaply, and then we expect that you'll raise the price later. So in order to prevent you from doing that, we're going to put a trade barrier in place. This is a much more politically charged argument. It's hard enough for us to determine whether or not a company is selling below cost in our own country, let alone whether a company in another country is selling at below cost. But this is sort of the idea of we're being flooded with cheap toys and cheap trinkets from China. We need to put a trade barrier in place. That's basically the retaliation for dumping. And then we have the wonderful special interest argument. This is the idea that there are some companies that simply do not want to have to compete. Or it's not that they don't want to, it's that it's easier to not compete. And so they lobby their congressmen, they lobby their representatives for special favors, for special privileges that allow them to engage in trade and not have to be as competitive. So they seek special privileges by making campaign donations or having some sort of agreement with members of Congress that allows them or that creates this barrier to trade to protect their interests and their interests alone. This is where the micro idea of trade barriers gets in the way of the macro, because the special interests don't care about the macro, they care about the micro. Well, that's about it as far as barriers to trade. Those are the main arguments in favor of barriers to trade, and even though we can look through those, they're very flimsy arguments. They're still made and they're still successfully made, which makes all of us worse off as consumers, because the more barriers to trade there are, the higher the prices we have to pay. And that brings us to the end of the semester. So our last topic here is international. This is a topic that we did kind of rush through, I must admit. This is a topic that is covered in depth in actually 2 different semesters here at Robert Morris, where we look at the impacts and more of the details of how international economics and international trade and finance happen. So if you're interested in those classes, I would certainly encourage you to pursue those things. And if you're interested in any other economics classes, please drop me an email. An econ minor is not a difficult thing to pursue. You only need, I believe, 4 other classes after this one to pick up that econ minor, and it certainly is a marketable thing to have on your college transcript. So with that, I will take my leave of you. I'll probably send out another message or 2 in terms of wrapping up the material, but for now, that's it. And thank you so much for your patience, and we'll see you soon, I hope.